talk about how to use our Stop Motion Studio app. Every time you animate a new scene for our animation, you need to create a new project. In order to do that, just click the plus in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and you'll open up your whole little animation zone, and this is automatically a new project. So what you'll notice on the screen is on the right hand side in the middle, you've got this big red dot. That's the camera shutter button. Over here on the left hand side, you have what's called the onion skin. I'm moving the little dot up and down on it right now. Now, the purpose of the onion skin is to allow you to see the previous picture so that you know how much you're moving your puppet when you're animating. This is super helpful. I have so many students who at first really don't want to use the onion skin because they feel like it kind of confuses things a little bit, but it's actually very handy for knowing just how much you've actually animated your puppet, for knowing if you've kept the rest of your puppet's body in proper alignment during your animation. And also, it's very common to accidentally knock your puppet or another piece of the scene out of its place during animation, which can be super frustrating. But if you have your onion skin on, you'll have that ghost of an image so that you can realign everything and you can just get right back to animating again. So let me show you what this onion skin does here. I'm going to take a picture. Now notice I've pulled my slider down just a little bit. Now I move his hand, and you can see that previous image just a little bit. If I move my slider, the image increases. Now all I can see when the slider is at the bottom is the previous image. And as I move the slider up, the image that's in my camera becomes more and more visible. I like to keep my onion skin somewhere right about here because then I can clearly see that previous image, but not so much that it interferes with my ability to tell what I'm doing on the current image. Now let's talk about frame rate. Frames per second, or FPS, that's the unit that we use to measure how many photographs we need to take to get 1 second of animation. With a typical film animation or movie, you record at 24 frames per second. With TV animation, it's 32 frames per second. For our stop motion animations, we're going to work at 12 frames per second. It's not uncommon for lower budget stop motions to work at 12 frames per second because it doesn't take as long to animate the project this way, but 12 frames per second is still fluid enough that you get a nice flow to your animation. It doesn't look too choppy. Now the way that we change our frames per second is look for the little gear button in your menu. On my iPad, I have a series of little buttons right above my timeline. There's a little gear button right there, and I can move my slider. Now if you've opened your app for the first time, it's usually set at 5 frames per second. That's too low for us. We're going to move our slider to 12 frames per second, and we're going to click done. Okay, so now let's move on to animation. Basically, the way that you animate any puppet, this is a flat paper puppet on my surface, but whether you're animating a flat paper puppet or a clay puppet or a wire armature, little thread wrapped puppet like we have in class, the principles for how you work with your animation are basically the same. In order to start an animation, you want to make small movements. Okay, so I've already got my first photograph here. I'm going to press my shutter button and notice that he's moved a little bit. Now, still see my onion skin. You can see the previous photo just a little bit. Press my shutter button again. Small movements. Animation is not a quick process, so take your time with it. Small movements. Notice how I've got my little picture counter down here. I can tell just how many seconds of animation I'm animating if I calculate how many photographs I have against my frame rate, which is 12 frames per second. So once I get to 12 pictures, I'll have animated 1 second of animation. Okay, so actually I think this is the 12th one. All right, now let's scroll through our animation. I can move my onion skin up so all I see is the picture. Press play. And you can see I have animated his arm moving up. Super simple animation. You can get much more complicated than this, obviously, but this is the basic principle of how to use the app. All right, so now let's talk about what do you do if you want to make your animation go slower or faster. So I'm going to turn my onion skin on again. Actually, I think I'm going to turn my onion skin on again. Just right about there. The bigger the movement you make, the faster your animation will be. So if you're making large movements, if say I want to move his hand back down by his side again, if I make large movements, he's going to do it super fast. So let's do bigger movements than what we were doing before. That's a lot bigger. So let's say he's just flopping his arm right back down. Okay, so let's scroll through this and see. Notice how much faster his arm dropped down. That's because we made bigger movements. Now let's say we want his arm to raise very slowly. So if we want it to raise very slowly, we have to take super small movements from what his previous position was. This is even less than what we were originally doing. Make sure your hand always stays out of the way of the camera. I make that mistake too. Almost all of my students make the mistake at some point. So make sure your hands are out of the camera before you take the picture. Just small movement, take the picture. Small movement, take the picture. Small movement, take the picture. Okay, let's check this out. Do you notice how his arm goes slower going up the second time than it did even the first time? And it was certainly slower than it dropped. Okay, so just remember, if you want to make your animation faster, do bigger movements. If you want to make it slower, do smaller movements. So smaller movements mean you have to take more pictures to get the same amount of animation or the same range of animation. So it will take more time for his arm to move up if you're doing tiny movements. And I think that that's about it for an introduction in how to use Stop Motion Studio. Now you can go ahead and try it out yourself and see what you can do.